All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me again. This is actually my 24th episode this year on YouTube. I really set out a goal this year to create one video a week on YouTube, and I really appreciate everyone's support in my YouTube channel. It's definitely grown, so thank you everybody for that. And just a heads up that my stretch mechanic course is coming out here very soon. There's a link down below to get on the wait list so you can get in on that. So today I have John Kettle with me, British coach, mountaineer, first ascensionist, and like a best-selling author of Rock Climbing Technique, Practical Guide to Movement Mastery. Thank you so much for being here, John.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you're at in the UK?
Sure. So I've been teaching climbing for about 20 something years now. And I guess I came into it, and I've been climbing for about 28 years. I guess I started as a teenager. I came into it really as an instructor and a guide, and then kind of evolved from there into a coach really about 10 or 15 years ago. And nowadays, I coach full time, and I coach people bouldering, sport climbing, and trad climbing. So all three, indoors, outdoors, a real mix. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I'm based in the Lake District, which is like North England.
Okay, great, awesome. So how I got to know you was actually I got your book, and I thought it was like super fascinating. I was like, oh my God, this is the book that's been needed to be written for such a long time. And we got to know each other through like stretch mechanic and just like talking. We're both on the PCC, so it's been really awesome to understand like your knowledge and the lens that you look through. And it is really like more of this movement and technique lens that I really do appreciate. And like in your title of your book is, Practical Guide to Movement Mastery. So with that, like what does mastery mean to you?
I guess it's a term I use to sum up someone's skill level, really. So it's not so much about knowledge, but it's about skill and the effort they have to go through mentally to do things well. So someone who's mastered something with, such as rock climbing, can perform skillfully in a really wide range of different environments. You can present them with all kinds of different challenges and puzzles and problems in climbing, and they can solve them without really having to think about it. Because the skills are practiced to a point where they can do it intuitively, essentially.
Do you think that we would ever be a master at something?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to define when you're a master of something. And the beauty of climbing is it's such a broad sport with so many sub-disciplines that there's probably always going to be some niche bit that you're rubbish at, So there's always a learning opportunity somewhere to get better at something, because there's all these specialists out there who are incredible in one area.
Yeah.
So there's always people to learn from. There's always ways to develop. I guess it's that difference between mastery being like a general, highly polished skill set and being perfect, which is like not really something humans can do, I don't think.
Yeah, totally. That perfectionism is something I want to come back to, because I think that in the term of like mastery, I think some people get really fixated on perfectionism, and especially when you're working on your technique, I think sometimes it can, like this thought of like trying to be perfect could almost pull you away from learning the skill. So in terms of like excellence, you have talked about excellence in your book, versus perfectionism. Like, what is your thoughts around that, and what should we be really focusing on?
I guess perfectionism has a collection of like potentially negative connotations with it, in terms of it's something that can't be achieved by humans, and the closest we get, in my experience, is like very fleeting moments of flow, or something where everything feels like it just clicks and happens right, which are really enjoyable in themselves, but they are temporary moments. And I think chasing a permanent state of that is going to lead to frustration, basically. Whereas I guess excellence is where you can accept that you've got flaws, and you'll probably always have flaws, but you can just be really motivated towards enjoying ironing out, finding those flaws and ironing them out and developing through them, and watching your strengths and weaknesses shift and change as your focus shifts and change between different areas that you want to get better at. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. In people who are perfectionists, I see like a quite a risk averse approach to learning. Sometimes they're so concerned about getting it right, they it becomes like it can sit with a fear of failure. Potentially perfectionism can. Whereas, like, to really embrace and learn things, you just need to be totally okay with being wrong all the time and making loads of mistakes. And once you're freed from that concern about getting it wrong and failing, then you're much more likely to, get closer to excellence and become excellent more effectively than the perfectionist. Really.
Yeah. Do you have a way for folks to get into that like excellence mindset where, or essentially like being okay with failure? Are there things that you get your students to focus on or to shift toward?
It's difficult. Like, fear of failure can like rule people's lives to some extent. So I don't
Yeah.
think there's a quick fix. Certainly not that I know of. I think being aware of it and being aware of when a fear of failure is when that's the thing that's limiting you, is good to know. So recognizing when you're not doing something because of who's watching,
Mhm.
or to do with the environment around you rather than the actual challenge you're faced with is a good indicator of that. Um, I quite often design the way I get my students to practice in such a way that they can't really fail, and that they can't use the normal measures of success and failure that they'd like to use. So if you want someone to work on a particular skill and you ask them to try it on the red climb at the local wall, then automatically they've got a measure for the red climb. It's like, if I get to the top without sitting on the rope, I've succeeded, and if I don't, I've failed. So automatically their fear of failure, if they have one, will be interfering with their attention on the skill you've given them. Whereas if you say, I want you to perform this skill and I want you to do it on this line using all available holds, then they're like, oh, they can't fail, and
Mhm.
they just give all their attention to the skill.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. And I think that like if let's talk about the skill though. So if you're giving someone a skill, like at what point do they self-correct or take note of, okay, I'm aware that I'm doing this wrong? That is almost like a perfectionist mindset. Like, how do you ask the students to self-correct or take note of like what they're doing?
I think generally I give them awareness-based exercises first, and then normally once they know what they're doing, that they could be doing better, then they will normally have a solution. And you can give them a drill, for example, which maybe allows them to rehearse more effectively. But they'll know what they want to do instead of the thing they're not doing right, pretty much as soon as they're aware of it. So, like, with a basic example like footwork, for example, if I say to someone, okay, climb this route and just tell me how many times your foot taps the wall and then slides down onto the hold, rather than going straight onto the hold, straight away they're like acutely aware of when it happens, because they've been primed by me. They probably already know that's not ideal technique, and they're doing it on an easy climb where there's no real reason for them not to place their feet accurately. They're being watched by a coach, which obviously puts pressure on them, as you know, it affects people's behaviour.
Mhm.
Um, and so they'll come down with a number, and if it's habitual, that tapping and sliding movement with their foot onto holds, then they'll do it a bunch of times, even though they're trying really hard not to, and they're being watched by a coach. So I haven't had to tell them they're doing anything wrong, really. I've just had to ask them to pay more attention and
Mhm.
really closely observe one thing about their movement. And when they come down, they'll be like, oh my God, I did it 15 times. And it's like, yeah, and that's probably a quarter of the number of times you would do it previously before I asked you to pay attention to it. So then, and they know what the solution is. It's not rocket science what you should do with your feet. So it's just about putting a spotlight on it, really. And then the solution's like, they know what to do, and they're like, can I do it? Can I please do it again? Like, let me show you my best footwork,
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So more awareness based skill drills will hopefully help them get away from that
Yes, yeah,
perfectionist
it's
mindset.
basically my job is to raise their awareness of what they're not doing right. And
Yeah.
so they can see that they're not doing it right, and they can go away and continue to see whether they're doing it right or whether they're not. And as long as their awareness is built, then I can then give them solutions if they want them, but quite often the solutions are dead obvious.
Yeah.
And I can be like, okay, so what should you be doing with the feet? And they'll tell you, they'll be
Yeah.
like, this is what I should be doing. Well, I don't know why my feet won't do it.
Yeah.
But they're totally sold on the idea of practicing it now. So it's like the problem is often self-fixing, even when you're not there, because
Yeah.
you know they're going to be thinking about their feet now, and they're going to be much more attentive to what they do with those feet.
Yeah. Yeah. And self-awareness and just body awareness in general seems to be kind of like maybe the foundation to really
Yeah.
build all of your technique on. So um have you developed any drills that actually improve body awareness, or like what are things that you have actually worked on for yourself to improve body awareness?
I think the number one thing would just be curiosity. Like, if you read through that book of mine, you'll see there's loads of questions in it, and they're often questions that are quite difficult to answer unless you've got good body awareness, basically. So I would say my number one way of building awareness for myself and for people I coach is just asking questions, like questioning stuff. And if they come, and if I say, like, tell me how many times did you flag on that route, and they go, oh, I don't know, then you're like, okay, climb it again, come down with a number. And yeah, it's just about raising that awareness, really. And I think you're totally right. That is the foundation. If you don't know you're not doing stuff right or as you want to, then there's no buy-in to changing the way you're moving. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'd say, like, yeah, questioning and curiosity would be the number one ways. There are various things you can do to back that up. Like, you could, like, videoing yourself helps you become aware of what you're doing, because you get a third person view of yourself climbing. And there are a bunch of other ways like that, or like asking friends. I guess the limitation with those is that there's practical limitations to videoing. And when you ask someone else for their view, you're hearing their opinion, you're hearing what you're doing through the filter of their life experience, I guess.
Yeah.
So if they're like really strong and powerful and they dive for everything, and you're like really thin and static and cautious, they're going to tell you that you should be more dynamic and powerful, when actually maybe your best style for you isn't like that. So yeah, everyone sees things through their own filter, and I guess the coaches are exactly the same. We're the same, and you've just got to look at the person and look at their CV, if you like, look at their background experience, the disciplines they're performing well in, and ask yourself whether that's where you want to go. Because if it is, then that's great. Their information is going to be useful. The more like you they are, if they're a similar build, that they're the same gender, they're much more likely to have relevant feedback, I think, potentially. So when you're vetting who to get advice off, I would say, weigh their advice up against how like you they are, and how much they represent your goals.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this isn't like an interesting question. What do you think about beta videos? So people who are trying to get on a climb and they like really watch these beta videos. Yeah, what is your personal opinion on beta videos?
Well, I think if you've seen the post I did recently on Instagram, you'll know that was me having a dig at beta videos. I'm from the old school where they weren't an option for ages, and I'm kind of now this old guy wandering around bouldering venues, being like, "Why has everyone got a camera on a tripod? What's wrong with them? Are they all really vain?" Um, and I can totally see why, because it does shortcut loads of time taken to figuring things out. But it depends a little bit on what you want from your climbing. And if you want to learn, then if you bypass the learning by looking at the answer, then you're not really going to learn much at all. If you want to send quickly and, tell everyone you've climbed a hard grade, then that's the fastest way to do it. And I think there's a middle ground where I use them when I've tried to work it out myself and been unable to. I've chatted to friends, haven't got any meter off them. I'll go and have a look and see if there are any videos. But quite often it'll be like, oh, I'm 5'4". This person in the video is 6 foot. It's like, well, that's no use. I maybe get the hand beta from that, but nothing else. So Yeah, I think, I drew a little flow chart about essentially the dead end you can get into looking for beta videos, finding they don't fit you because they're a different size or, different strengths and weaknesses, or just not finding them. And it's very striking to me now that if I publish a video of a boulder problem locally, on Instagram, for example, that boulder problem gets lots of repeats in the next month or two, because people know what to do on it. And before I published that, they didn't know what to do and they didn't have the capacity to work it out. Right. So I think, I'm very much of like, use them, but just be aware that you're sidestepping a really valuable skill, which is learning how to read rock. And there's only one way to climb that fits you perfectly, and it isn't on that beta video if it's not a video of you, so you won't get that from videos. And people who are really good at working stuff out for themselves without the video assistance, they tend to flash really hard. If they're bouldering, they'll be able to see things, and their first go will be really, really close to the successful beta they need. So they tend to flash close to their max grade. They tend to get from trying a problem to sending it really, really fast, because they get so much information from every go and so much feedback, and they're so accurate from the word go with working out what fits them exactly. And folks who are really video dependent are really limited in their options, because they can only really go and do the problems which have videos, or the routes which have videos too. And then they can get hung up on someone else's beta that doesn't actually fit them. And, I have these conversations with people where they're like, I've been trying this for ages. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't do that. I do it this way, completely different. And they're like, oh, right. They try that and it fits them perfectly, because they're closer to my size than the video.
Yeah.
But I think it's similar in a way to like beta sprayers at the gym. Yeah. It's like, if you get beta sprayed at you, you might get the problem done quicker, but you won't learn anything, and you'll just have to go and find another problem. Right. To have fun learning on, really. And for me, it's like, people ruin my day if they tell me the beta. It's like, don't do that, because I'll climb it and then I'll have to find something else, and I hate it because I like problem solving. Yeah, it is like, I do go back and forth. I think I'm kind of the same. Like, there's certain times that I really like to problem solve. And what I've noticed, at least in the climbing community, is like, I think our grades have gotten higher. Like, more people are sending harder and harder stuff. But does that mean that they're actually better rock climbers? Like, that's, I think, maybe really the question. And I think it is finding that middle ground. Like, I almost find that analyzing your own movement on your videos you might be able to glean more information from that than seeing someone else's that's
video.
really useful. That's really useful, especially if you're getting feedback from your friends and you don't really believe them. If you're not bought into their feedback, you're like, really? If you see the video, then you're like, oh, okay, you're right, or no, you're wrong, look. One way or another, it helps add to credibility of information you're not so sure about, that you're getting from yourself. Like, maybe you don't know which foot popped first when you fell off. If you videoed it, you can watch it and be like, oh, okay, it's that foot, so that's where I need to put my attention. But like anything, if you develop a high level of awareness, you won't need the video, because you'll know which foot popped. So there's always a way without the video that you can build on too.
Excellent. Okay, so in your book, you had talked about this concept of movement literacy. I really love this concept. It's kind of what has driven a lot of my like movement practice on and off the wall. So I would love to hear like your definition of movement literacy, and how to essentially start to build this.
Okay. I guess I use movement literacy as a term because people can, they can relate that to like written and reading literacy, and the understanding that lots of people can read, but some people can read much better than others. Even as adults, there's a really big difference. Some people's spelling or ability to write clearly might be far better than others, and it has a big impact on their ability to communicate sometimes, to share ideas and information. And we've all been through this difficult cognitive stage of literacy where we had to like copy out individual letters and put our finger between the words and stick our tongues out as we wrote, and then learn to join up there's this obvious like skill acquisition process, which I'm trying to teach people with climbing, which they've been through already, so they can, it's a useful analogy, if you like, to that. So I use it from that respect. But I guess what movement literacy means for climbers really is if there's certain movements they're really unfamiliar with. So if you were missing a handful of letters of the alphabet, you could probably communicate fine most of the time. There'd be certain things you wouldn't be able to say, and you might find workarounds for them, but they wouldn't be quite as good. And it's the same with climbing. If there's certain techniques that, for reasons of your flexibility or your strength, or just the practice you've had and the environment you've practiced in, that have been really neglected, then you're going to avoid them when you're under stress, as well as be less skillful at those. So the more stress we put you under, if we put you on a pumpy route or a scary route, then you're going to revert to the stuff you've practiced the most, which is like your favorite words, if you like, and your vocabulary is going to shrink, your movement vocabulary, and that could cost you, because the rock doesn't care for your movement vocabulary. It says like, here I am, and you have to bring your A game to me, and you have to adapt to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not adapting to you. I guess that's the rock's approach. So we have to be like, okay, I want to be as literal. I want to be like Shakespeare, and then I can adapt to this boulder problem, this climb, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
that. Yeah, it's essentially, it works as a metaphor well for a lot of people.
yeah. Oh man, I really love that analogy of putting it into like a sentence. Can you create that sentence
Yeah.
on the rock? That's like so cool to think about. So in terms of like building your own like movement toolbox or
Mm.
literacy, like what experiences have helped you the most, or like what have you been working on?
I guess there's several levels you can look at. You can look at it off the wall. Like there's a level of like fundamental movement literacy which people bring to climbing when they start climbing, and there's a reason why like dancers and martial artists and gymnasts go really well through the grades when they start climbing, and that's because they're bringing a really high level of movement literacy. So their balance, their awareness of where their limbs are in space, are all really finely tuned already. And that's movement literacy. So at the fundamental level, there's lots of stuff you can do off the wall. I would look at your background and your previous sports you've done, and that will have a big influence on your literacy. So a lot of running sports may give you good balance and good awareness and good agility, for example, whereas a lot of time spent upside down, like in trampolining or gymnastics, will give you a really good awareness of where you are in space, because you can't just use your eyes and nothing else for it. So there's certain things that will build you up well there. And then I guess within climbing, once you start to zoom in, which is the kind of area I have most interest in, then it's working out what you don't do. So that comes back to that curiosity thing and asking yourself questions like, why do I, if I was to ask someone what animal I personify when I climb, like what animal would they say? And and what's the opposite animal from that one? So I get described as my mate described it. He says I'm like crouching tiger on the rock. So I'm like attacking everything. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm not like, I'm not like a heron, for example, or something that's like graceful and moving lightly. So then it's like, right. So how could I move like a heron?
Yeah.
That's the basic side of it, if you like. It's getting that picture of how you move, what it looks like. So that's your favorite words. That's your current vocabulary at its strongest. And then it's like, well, what don't I do? So if you love rockovers, it's like, okay, so you probably don't use intermediate feet that often. So maybe you need to work on seeing and using lots of small photons if you do a lot of rockovers. It might also mean you do a lot of locking off. That potentially means you might do quite a lot of crimping, because that works best low down. Maybe you avoid compression stuff or slopery things that might give us some clues about how well you position yourself beneath the holes. Because if you're not great at positioning, you can compensate for that more on a crimp or a half crimp. So there's lots of clues, but it's curiosity, I would say, is the simplest way. It's not a very clear answer, sorry, but
Yeah.
it's this it's the basic way that you've got to go into it. You've got to
Yeah.
be curious, and you've got to be like, okay, what kind of creature am I?
Yeah.
What's my vocabulary bias towards? Okay, how could I improve that? How could I broaden it?
Yeah. Well, do you kind of believe in approaching like movement literacy almost in a generalist view? Like, would you say like if you're not super graceful, maybe taking a couple dance classes or something, or maybe experimenting with other types of movement education to then help your climbing? What do you think about that?
I think it's a good idea. I think it depends a little bit on the openness and the mindset of the person I'm coaching, and also on their availability of time. If they're mad keen on climbing and you say you should really go to some ballet lessons, then they might struggle to see the specificity there
Yeah.
of it. Um, Certainly, it's something I've tried myself. So I studied Aikido for 3 years in my quest to be more like a heron than a tiger. And it was really interesting just studying a totally different movement discipline from a totally different culture with a completely different approach and attitude towards what constituted good movement. So I did learn a great deal from doing that. Um, and Yeah, I think it's a good idea if you've got the time and the capacity. Yoga is a really popular one for that, helping people to relax in stress positions, basically, which
Yeah.
is kind of what route climbing is.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really useful if you have the time and the headspace to take on something else.
Yeah.
Um, and there's some great folk out there who have a really good grasp of the non-climbing, like floor-based movement skills like you do. So seeing folk who have all the animal flow stuff dialed and kind of the Ido Portal approach to things. And I think those are all super fascinating. And if didn't have to work for a living, then I would just run around like a little kid in a
Yeah.
playground, I think, trying all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think actually for coaches, it seems like, especially like this is kind of like your thing, like experimenting with some of these little things can also give you a better perspective of your own sport that you're coaching, and gives you more perspective on like your own movement and kind of like where you're lacking. Yeah, like I think that's where uh, what I like to like essentially ask coaches to do is like experiment, explore. Whereas like the clients, yeah, it's a little bit harder. Like, yeah, they only have like, oh, I have like 6 hours to train this week. I can really only climb,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
If you say
Yeah.
experiment and explore, they're like, that
Yeah.
is really vague advice.
Yeah.
Like, come
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think it's really just for maybe like us nerds.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So kind of like segueing from that, like when you improve your movement literacy, you kind of have this greater ability to be creative and being able to improvise. And you talked about this in your book, and I think even you just did a performance climbing coach presentation earlier this year. Where does creativity and improvisation, like, what role does that play, and how do you guide your clients into thinking about those things?
I think almost see them as two quite distinctive things. So creativity, I think, is super, super important. Like, and again, that's where I'm trying to steer people away from beta videos because I want them to be creative, and that kind of is a creativity stifling thing. And it's where, for me, I find I'm much more motivated for outdoor climbing than indoors because of the wider scope for creativity with how I move because there's more holes, essentially, more features, and everything's more complex. And when I do climb indoors, I'm really pleased when I do stuff that the way the setter didn't intend. That for me is like a massive reward because
Yeah.
I've been creative and I've beaten them with creativity. Yeah. So I always do that, and I quite often climb boulder problems outside with deliberately different beta as well. Like I climb them the way they're meant to be climbed, and then I start with my hands crossed and try some really obscure heel hook or something that I've seen that I thought might work. And I think creativity is, like, for me, it's the bedrock of climbing, and it's the reason I climb really like. It's my creative expression time. It's my climbing time. So I really encourage creativity in climbers, and I think that comes back to curiosity. Really, creativity is essentially curiosity at work. With improvisation, I think there's like a yin and a yang of like improvisation and the ability to forecast, plan, and predict what you're most likely to do. And if you go too heavy on one or the other, then your climbing can suffer a bit for it. So people who climb totally intuitively basically improvise all the time, but they don't tend to reflect on what they do. And that means that if the climb is difficult to slow down and think about what you need to do on, or their movement literacy they bring onto that climb isn't good enough to find the best solution mid-climb, then they're kind of in trouble and they're stuck. Whereas the person who can look at it from the floor and work out, because they're very good at predicting and forecasting, they can work out what they're very, very likely to do, saves themselves a massive amount of headspace once they start climbing, and they can climb much faster as a result. They can climb faster through the tricky bits, and they don't have to think about as much. They're generally more relaxed and more attentive to exactly what's going on around them. And the ideal climber, I guess, in my mind, would have both. They'd be really good at both. So they'd be able to get as much information as possible from the rests or from the ground. And then once they get on, they're highly tuned to what their body's telling them in terms of visceral feedback about their balance and their position in the holds. And they're able to respond intuitively to that and improvise and make those changes whilst climbing. So it's like they're not dependent on figuring it out from the floor, and they're not dependent on figuring it out as they go.
Yeah.
They've got this interdependence, and they can switch back and forth from one to another. And that's what I see in the really good climbers.
Yeah.
They're like, I thought this would happen, but when I got there, I realized this, so I quickly did that.
Yeah.
And like, wow, cool. It just looked like it was planned to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're really fast, those ones. They're very fast climbers. And, you know, it's time of detention that does for you at the end of the day. So being fast, if you can still maintain your skill level, is generally a good thing.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Okay, so I did want to go into more some of the technical stuff. Let's go into like some nuts and bolts stuff. So intermediate climbers, what are some common technical flaws that you see in this
Okay.
grouping?
Can you define intermediate climbers?
Yeah, let's go. So let's do bouldering grades because that's easier for me. Probably like what, V2 to V4-ish?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question was, what are the most common problems I see?
Yeah.
At that level, I'd probably say it's generally about move reading. So it's about figuring out the beta, and it's about, and I guess this is related, it's about footwork. So it's about being suitably precise with their feet so that when they shift up to V5, they can actually stand on the tiny holds and fully weight them. And part of that is seeing those holds as an opportunity, as an performance they can use. So that comes back to move reading, really. So I think quite a long way up into those grades, depending on the level of like basic strength they bring to the sport, they can grab and pull their way up those things. And they'll find, I guess it'll become apparent if that's their default technique, if you put them on a slab where grabbing and pulling doesn't work, and see whether they can balance their way up it, which means they have to be led by their foot choices rather than yarding harder on the hands, if you like. So I'd say the most common stuff at that level, would be to do with move reading. Generally, I see folk misread stuff constantly at those grades and waste a ton of energy doing that. And boulders particularly becoming more reflective, so being able to remember what they've done after a go and being able to tweak that, try something different, getting like that process to a level where it happens quickly and intuitively. It's hard going, but that will serve them really well as they move up the grades.
Yeah, that move, remembering moves seems to be really tricky for people in that range. And you know, I think it again, it comes back to the awareness and just trying to build that awareness. Would you say there's anything else that someone could work on to try to help remember their movement?
Um, I think it basically comes down to practice. You'll know, some people are really good at, have like a photographic memory of every move they've done for the last 10 years. And other people come down and they're like, I've no idea what just happened. So we all exist on a spectrum there. And I think I can reassure people that I've no idea what happened then for like at least the first 15 years of my climbing career. I was good at improvising as a result, as you can imagine, but not
Yep.
very good, terrible at predicting. And I realized that was a thing that I can improve on, and I practiced at it and practiced at it. And now I'm at a point where I don't have to think about it at all.
Mm.
And I come down from whatever I've climbed, whether it's like a 5-move boulder problem or a 50-move route, and I could tell you 100% certainty exactly what my hand sequence was for all of that. Probably about 90% certainty what the feet were I used.
Mm-hmm.
And that is purely the product of practice. I'm not an intuitive rememberer. I've just practiced remembering it. And I think as a coach, what I often have to do when I'm coaching is remember someone else's sequence as I watch them. So then I can see what they remembered and compare it to what I observed. So actually I'm practicing it while I'm coaching as well.
Yeah.
And try to remember what they said they'd do, what they did, and what they think they did, which is like 3 different sequences sometimes. So it just comes with practice, and it's totally worth practicing. And the hardest bit is at the start, where it takes so much mental effort to remember anything. So that the trick really, if you're new to this and you're thinking, oh, that's me, I need to work on this, is to just reduce the task size to a manageable size. So for example, go onto the easiest circuit in your local wall and aim to remember when you come down, climb a problem however you like, and when you come down from it, aim to recount just the hand sequence you use from start to finish, and work around the whole circuit doing that. And if you get down and you think, this was my hand sequence, actually I'm not sure, climb it again and keep climbing it until you definitely know what the hand sequence is, and then move on. And that will be my kind of friendliest start point. And then I'd start to ramp up the demand. So I'll be like, right, what were the feet doing as well? Because once you know what the hands and feet were doing, you can start to picture yourself climbing. You can get this like third person image of yourself climbing. And then when you've got that going on, you can see what is going on between your hands and feet. So you can get the twisting and the turning and all the shapes, and start to like build a visceral prediction of what's going to happen when you climb. And that's how people like Adam Ondra, Flash V15, because they get the whole experience down to a level of like really high quality visualization before they even touch the rock.
Yeah.
And it starts with remembering what your hands did.
Yeah.
On the easiest circuit.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Awesome. So like with practice, I know that like in your presentation for the PCC, you had kind of given 3 different ways of practicing. That was like block practicing, randomized, and varied. I think
that's right. Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind just giving like a really quick summary of what those are and where climbers maybe should focus most of their time.
Yeah, okay. So I guess this comes out of skill acquisition research. If you're wondering where this information came from, then it's kind of well established in that field of science. And they've essentially subdivided ways of practicing into 3 basic types. Block practice is doing the same task over and over again. So for example, if you were learning to write, block practice would be writing the letter A with your right hand over and over again in capitals. And then varied practice is switching tasks between each one, but in a structured manner. So you might write the alphabet over and over again. So you're writing A, but then you're writing B, and then you're writing C, and so on. And then you get back to the start and write the alphabet again. That would be varied practice. And then random practice would be like just writing things, or writing a random collection of letters. And that would be random practice. And I guess the result is that if you're measuring how, what the scientists want to know is how do those types of a practice affect how good we get at the skill we're practicing. So if your goal was to get better at writing the letter A, how well would the person who just wrote A over and over again be compared to the one who wrote the alphabet over and over again, compared to the one who just wrote a story, for example. And the results aren't kind of quite as obvious as you might think, because they measure how well you've learned it by 3 ways. How quickly you improved, so the speed you acquired the skill at, how well you retained the skill, so whether it's stuck in your brain or whether you forgot it pretty rapidly. And the other measure is how well you can adapt the skill, so how well you could take that and adjust it to suit something slightly different. And adaptability of the skill isn't super important to something like writing the letter A, assuming you're always going to write it with the same hand. But it is really important for things like climbing, for complex open skills where no single hand move is ever the same. You have to be able to adapt really, really well to all these slightly differences between every single move. In the same way for tennis, like it looks like quite a close skill, but no shot you receive is ever the same, is it? Through your entire tennis career. So you have to be really adaptive with receiving shots. So those are the 3 measures, and what they tend to find is blocked practice, writing A over and over again, leads to the fastest acquisition, so you get better really quickly. But it leads to really poor retention. If they test someone's ability on that 3 weeks later without further practice, they haven't retained that skill anywhere near as well as the other 2 forms of practice, random and varied. So it looks like they're getting better really quickly, and if you're a coach and you're teaching, it looks like your students are getting better really well within the session. But if you were to test them in a few weeks' time, they would actually perform quite poorly compared to the other styles of practice. Random practice is the slowest for acquiring the skill, because you might only be writing the letter A, once every 100 letters, for example. So it's unstructured and it's kind of hard to predict how well you'll improve. And then that middle one, varied practice, is the best for retention. And it's kind of second equal for speed of acquisition. So it's not as quick as block practice for acquiring the skill, but you retain it really, really well. And that's thought to be to do with the fact that because because the things you're practicing are varying slightly, you're having to uncouple the brain from the letter A writing pattern, for example, and then do the B one and then the C one. And then when you come back to A, you have to recouple it with A. And it's the process of pulling that skill out of your head, finding it in your brain, performing it, putting it away, and then retrieving it again. It's that retrieval process that actually makes the skill stick. So if you just write loads of A's, you only have to retrieve it once and then you just repeat. Whereas if you have to write the letter A and then do a push-up and then write the letter A, that's varied practice, because you have to forget about the A, change gear, do the push-up, come back to the letter A, retrieve it again. So it's the retrieval process. So this is why you see football teams rotating between different drills. They don't just stay on the same drill station and practice their throws or something like that. They switch between all of them and they keep doing different ones, because it's ungearing and regearing from the skill, which actually embeds it deeply. It builds the neural pathways that lead to better learning. So varied is like the golden type of practice I would recommend, that sits between just doing something over and over and over and going climbing, which is random practice, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think for setting up your training session, and this is kind of going into how to build your training session, how to put in this very focused practice into your training cycle. It seems like there's a place for each thing. And I've experimented with randomized practice, and I definitely get very frustrated when I'm doing it that way. And I'm I know that this is going to yield some really great adaptability skill sets, but it is so frustrating to learn that way. So in terms of having all of these 3, do you have a specific way, let's say we're still talking about maybe the V2, V3 climber. Do you have a certain way of presenting the drills and how they do the drills?
I think when you're trying to learn a movement and you're trying to switch from a block practice, which would be literally repeating, say, one hand move over and over again, the way to switch that up to increase the value of how well you learn it is just to focus on that one move, but do it with alternating hands. That would do it. So make a dead point with the right hand and then with the left hand. That's enough to make it varied. Or it can be essentially performing the skill on different holds every time. So with the foot accuracy one, for example, if you were to do it, on the same 2 foot moves over and over again, you'd get more accurate at those 2 foot moves, but you actually wouldn't become increasingly consistent to foot accuracy. Whereas if you just say, I'm going to do the V2 circuit, focusing on the quality of my foot placement, that would be varied practice, because you'd stand on like 200 different holds. And you'd be on all these different angles, and your hands would be in different positions. So straight away, you're getting to varied practice, and your ability to place your feet precisely is really becoming an adaptive skill.
Yeah. Yeah. And would you say that, so is your definition of randomized practice for climbing is like just going and trying a bunch of different climbs? Is that
Fully
your
random
definition?
would just be going climbing.
Yeah.
It'll be going climbing, and when you go climbing, for example, we're talking about that dead point move. Some, various points in your climbing career, you'll do some dead points, but you don't know whether they'll all be left-handed or right-handed, or none of them will be to a pocket, or they'll all be off a sloper. It's completely out of your control if it's random. So there's a very good chance you'll develop, you'll be better at one thing than the other. You'll have some massive gaps in your dead pointing technique. As if you said, I want to get good at dead pointing, I'm going to dead point to a pocket with a left hand and then a sloper with a right hand, and then I'm going to climb all these V0s by doing double dynamos up the holds. Yeah. So every move's a dead point, and every move's different. Yeah. So I'm not doing the same double dynamo over and over. Then you'd be like in that middle ground of not just trying one dead point over and over.
Yeah.
And not just hoping the dead points will turn up someday and you're climbing and you slowly get better.
Yeah.
You'd be in the middle ground of going, I'm going to dead point deliberately all the time, but I'm going to make it very varied.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, especially when it comes to projecting, I find this, like if you're projecting something, you're like, oh, I'm actually not great at doing, maybe the lock off. So then you train specifically. So I almost wonder sometimes like whether training that specific, I think it's gonna be great for your project, but maybe long term, might actually hold you back.
Yeah, there's a reason why you can quite easily find people who projected really hard, but they're not very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the difference, I guess, between someone whose practice has been very narrow and blocked in order to achieve this one thing, and someone who's chasing mastery, who's like, I'm going to progress much more slowly, but I'm going to progress much more in a much more broad skill. So they'll be very, very consistent. And you could be like, maybe this one person's projected to V10, and this person who's mastery focused has not climbed hard on V8. But this V8 one, it's like any V8 you point them out on, any rock type, high ball, short, bunch, tall, cracks, overhang, slabs, they'll do it in 2 or 3 sessions. Whereas this one's done a V10 in 16 sessions, but then they routinely get shut down on V7s.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the difference between what you get from a mastery focus versus projecting, where you can push up these higher like spikes of performance above your general level.
Yeah. That is a really great point. And I think something to remember for folks who kind of go on that mastery road where they're like, oh, I'm just like working on my skill set, that it's okay to be where you're at right now, because later you are going to hit those higher levels that you're seeking. And I think it gleans more information for folks who are performing at a high level on certain boulders, but then they're like, oh yeah, I have a really hard time on sighting V6. I think that's really important for folks like that to hear. Like I definitely need to hear that too.
Yeah, it's I think the reason everyone's not chasing mastery is because it's so easy to be results driven in climbing, because everything's graded, and it's harder on the ego to not project.
Yeah.
Because you don't get the special numbers. You know?
Yeah.
And you have to be like, I could climb harder if I was willing to put 10 plus sessions into a problem.
Yeah.
But like for me, for example, for whom, when I go climbing, it's like I'm like a kid going to a playground. I'm super excited and I want to do everything. And as a result, I have very little interest in projecting. So the hardest I've ever climbed has been in 3 sessions. That's the longest I've ever spent on any route or any boulder problem. And yeah, that's all
Yeah.
I'm psyched for.
Yeah.
When the creative process starts to dry up and it starts to become more repetitive, my motivation plummets. I'm an absolute
Yeah.
sucker for novelty.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and you know, and some extent, I'm like, oh, you know, people are like, oh, John, you could climb this and that, and I'm like, yeah, but I'm not really motivated to. And the limiting factor on everyone is their
Yeah.
motivation.
Yeah.
I want to climb everything. I'd
Yeah.
rather do that than climb like this and that hard thing and miss
Yeah.
out on all of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just my personal motivation, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I'm happiest doing that, and I'd be miserable climbing harder and projecting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does, I guess, come down to the person. And I do wonder, like, is it worth trying to push in either direction for a little bit to see, does it motivate you? Or okay, is that just something that's just gonna like torture you? And
Yeah,
now you're not climbing for the right purposes.
yeah. I
Um,
think you should totally explore it. That comes back to curiosity. Like I'm
yeah.
like, why don't I like projecting? I don't ignore it and be like, oh, I just don't like it. I'm like, I want to know why I don't like projecting.
Yeah.
So I've gone and tried to project, and I've noticed what emotional response I get to going back to the same climb, you know, for the 5th day in a row. And yeah, and I've
Yeah.
kind of tried to build my understanding of what it is. There's a barrier between me and projecting.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to climb harder, I'd have to work my way through that barrier.
Right.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
think if you don't like projecting, that's absolutely fine. Um, yeah, join the club. That's the one
Yeah.
I'm in. But but it's still good to know why you don't like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. The kind of going into kind of like the coach's role
Hmm.
for learning, for helping their students like learn technique. What role do you think the coach should be playing as the student learns a technique?
Oh, um, that's a tricky one. It kind of
Yeah.
depends on their needs, really, but they should be very focused on what the students' needs are and supporting their needs, really. Um, and I think the role the coach should be playing depends also a lot on the coach's philosophy, like what the coach thinks they should be doing. And I think that varies enormously between individuals. It's worth knowing what your philosophy is as a coach, what you think is important to your climbers. I don't think there's a correct philosophy. So,
Mm.
you know, I can
Mhm.
tell you what my philosophy is and what I think students need from me, but um, I don't get the students who want something else. They go to coaches who provide those things, you know.
Yeah.
So, and that's
Yeah.
a reflection of my philosophy. So, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that springs to mind when you ask that is about this coach as, have you heard the analogy of the coach as a gardener?
No.
Oh, this is awesome. So essentially, just like a gardener, you know, you'll be given these people to coach who are essentially your flowers, and your job is to set up the environment in such a way that when they're ready for it, they can blossom and bloom, and they can be the best flower that they can be. But you can't tell them when to flower. You
Mm.
can't tell them how tall to grow. You can water them and make sure they get sunlight, and you know, feed the soil and all those things. And essentially, that's your role. In my mind, that works well for me as my role as a coach. You can't shout at them to grow faster. It doesn't
Right.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then the flip side of this, maybe you can't or don't really want to answer this, but what do coaches tend to do wrong when it comes to their students and learning technique, maybe specifically?
Hmm. Um, I guess sometimes they get really stuck into showing them. So I'd
Mm.
always say ask, don't tell.
Mm.
And the same goes with showing. Like you should be asking them, and you should go in there with the mindset that actually you don't know what the best technique is for them, because they're not you. They've got different hips, they've got different joints, they're a different size and shape, they've got a different movement history up to this point. So you don't actually know what the best technique is for them. And you can, if you ask the right questions and you watch them and you give them things to experiment with and see how they respond, you'll start to get a better idea of what works for them and what doesn't. But I think, yeah, I think making assumptions and then showing them the correct way is the biggest risk. Like, don't end up as a beta sprayer, you know,
Yeah.
because then really all you're trying to do is get them quick success in that session,
Yeah.
because they've topped the problem. And that's why I'm such a fan of not using set problems, using like skill stuff on Rainbow. And I really don't want to see them get on something hard unless I want certain information out of that attempt. That's for them in their own time. I want to see them do stuff really, really well in a kind of neutral environment where they can focus purely on doing stuff well. So yeah, most of the stuff I get people to do, we make up individual moves for it, or we climb a mixture of problems. So,
Yeah.
and again, that comes back to that fear of failure thing. It just takes that out the side, and they don't default to getting to the top.
Yeah.
At some point, they just stick with the program.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's important for coaches to remember is that we don't always have to have the answer, actually, because the student actually does have the answer for themselves.
Yes, yeah, they do.
Yeah.
And like, no one knows the student better than they do.
Yeah.
Like, we're just guessing until we get to the technology where we can see inside people's heads. We're just guessing. And most of the time, there's a good chance of the time we're wrong. So that's why questions are so important, because questions draw out what you can't see.
Yeah.
So you've got to be good at questioning, and you've got to listen really carefully to the responses. And in that respect, having a kind of big toolbox of skills, and then being able to respond and change your plan constantly in response to the questions, and pull different things out of that toolbox is I would say, is a really good student-centered way of coaching. Yeah. Whereas if it's coach-centered, which is the risk with less experienced coaches, it's like they make a plan, they may not have even met the student at this point, and then they stick to the plan.
Right.
And that's centered around them and their plan. That's not centered around the student.
Yeah.
So, adaptability is the best ability for coaches as well as climbers.
Yeah. Great advice. Awesome. In terms of, so going back to working the technique, what intensity are people generally working at when let's say you're getting them to work on a rainbow wall and you're having them focus on a foot placement? How hard are they trying at that point? Like, how physical is the climbing?
Generally, we start with it super, super low, so they can give all their attention. Like, essentially, intensity, if it's moderate or high intensity, is a distraction from the task at hand. Mm-hmm. So it'd be like teaching someone the piano and having like an orchestra play alongside them every time they start practicing. It'd be really distracting, because it's this really shouty feedback from your forearms that it just takes you away. So I want them to be super attentive to one thing. That's what we do best, really. And I will dial down the difficulty as low as I possibly can. The only time I would start to compromise on that is when the skill they're working on, when they get clearer feedback from it at a higher intensity. So, for example, with heel hooks, like, you can work on heel hooks on a vertical wall, but it's harder to tell on that terrain, on big holes, how much weight they take off your core, depending on where they are, where your heel is relative to your center of mass. Whereas if I put you on like a 60-degree roof, get you climbing that on jugs, you'll know when your feet are your heels are in the right place and when they're not. Like, you'll get really loud visceral feedback. Likewise, twisting, if we get you to do it on something very steep, you won't want to bend your arms. You'll be totally sold on twisting and keeping your arms straight. Whereas if we try it on a vert wall, you could kind of get away with either, depending on the hold orientation. So that's the balance you're trying to make. It's like that often there's certain terrain gives much clearer, louder feedback, which is easy to understand, but you've just got this little time window before your student's exhausted. So if you do it on that, you've got to be aware of that. And they could do it all day on this friendlier angle, but they won't get the loud feedback that might be like, oh, right, that's why. So I might mix it up sometimes. I'd introduce it on the easier angle. If I'm not sure they're fully getting it, we'll do a little bit on something where it's like they cannot miss the feedback from their body because it's so steep. It's almost impossible not to do the technique I'm encouraging to. And then we'll talk about dialing it back, if you like.
Great. And like, with kind of that intensity, there's also the stress component. So this is kind of like the last thing I kind of want to talk about before we wrap up is you talk about how stress can inhibit our movement. What are some things, like, first of all, maybe elaborate a little bit about what that means?
Mm.
And then some situations that can help a student dial back their stress or to be able to deal with that.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the stress we were just talking when we were talking about intensity, we like high intensity there is like physical stress essentially interfering with your attention. And I'd always start at low stress just to put it home that like if they can't do this skill really well under no stress, there's very little chance they can do it well when they're stressed.
Mhm.
So they might think, why has he put me on this ludicrously easy climb? And it's like, well, if you can't do it well on here, what chance have you got, on the
Yep.
harder stuff? So show me it well here first. But then there's a clear pathway from there to still doing it under massive stress, whether that's psychological stress, mental, physical stress, combination of those things, because there's people watching you, or you've got conditions, you've got a tiny conditions window and you've driven a crazy distance, or you're in danger because you're on some sketchy route. And then that's when you most want these skills to be available, all of your skills. So there's definitely a process of taking them from the easy stuff to being stress proofed enough that they're still available on the hard stuff. So the process of getting there, for most folk, is twofold really. It's one of repetition, like just volume of practice that's required, and it's one of gradually increasing intensity or mixed intensity. If we're coming back to varied practice, I wouldn't say you have to like go up one grade at a time. You can be much more messy and chaotic than that and just go all over the grades, as long as your awareness remains high, so you appreciate when your technique goes a bit pear-shaped, and you recognize that it's stress affecting that. And we all have that at the top of our ability. And as long as you're aware of it and you're like, oh yeah, man, my feet have gone really bad and this is not ideal now, but I know why. And it's just a reminder to work on this stuff when I get back on an easy route if I survive this one, So yeah, as long as your awareness is there, even when you're not deliberately practicing, then you're picking up on the feedback to tell you what to work on when you're less stressed. And with the kind of ideal intensities really for stress proofing, I would say for most people, there's their top grade up here where all their attention is on not falling off, and they don't want to be having to think about the technique. And then a tier or two below that, there's a grade where they can climb it really well, but only if they bring their A game to it, like only if they're really focused and attentive. And if they're a bit lazy or distracted, it'll be pretty shoddy, the performance will be. So that's the tier at which you want to stress proof. You want to come down a notch or two from the bit where you're absolutely eyes out, working super hard, and you want to come down a notch or two and think, at this grade, I can, this might be the grade I can flash if everything goes really well, or the grade at which I can be really precise, I can remember to breathe, I can do all the things that I forget on harder stuff. And I'm going to try and climb this grade really, really well, like some kind of amazing expert. And that's laying you're a product on those top grades. What we see is a product of what you've done on these lower grades further down the pyramid. So yeah, bringing it down a notch to the point where you can execute as closely to perfectly as possible is the place where the stress proofing, I think, really works well.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And at
love
that
that.
grade, yeah,
Yeah.
those are grades you can repeat things at potentially as well. So those are the grades at which I might do it in a go or two, but if I haven't done it that well, I'll be pulling back on and trying to do it better, which I
Mhm.
can't really do on my max grade.
Mhm.
I'm just laid on the floor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. I do like that concept of stress proofing and kind of uh, choosing grades and intensities that way, and just say, okay, yeah, this is actually helping me stress proof. That's awesome. So, one last question before you go. What is your one piece of advice that you would love to give to people who are trying to improve their technique?
Oh, that's a tough question.
You only
One
get
piece of
one.
advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man, I
Oh,
wrote a whole book on
yeah.
that, and I left loads of stuff out of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, one piece of advice. I would say get curious. Get curious about your movement. Look at it really closely and ask yourself questions. and yeah, copy other people's beta if it doesn't match yours. All of those things to try and explore like why you do what you do.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much, John.
Thank
We're
you.
going to all try to get more curious about our movement.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks so much. And we'll be talking soon.
Awesome. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye bye.